Most marketing teams treat media creative data as three different or separate departments. Today's guest says that separation is exactly why the growth stalls.
Paying to rent a transaction from Meta and Google, because the likelihood is you'll probably have to pay again to acquire the same user. Brand isn't there just to refill that, but it's also there to prime the users that are entering the market. So it's acting as like a cognitive shortcut, so that people aren't just seeing your product, but they're now seeing a brand that they're familiar with and a brand that they trust.
What's the hidden cost of running a brand purely on performance budgets?
Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning in, where we connect the dots between MarTech and marketing landscape. Stay tuned to MarTech 360 as we explore key strategies for your marketing success.
Everything is connected at the root. Division is the illusion. Hold on to this. Most marketing teams treat media creative data as three different or separate departments. Today's guest says that separation is exactly why the growth stalls. Media Strategist from Jellyfish has spent years helping brands fix that. This conversation is about what actually works when you have unified media, creative, and data. Hi everyone, welcome to the MarTech 360 Conversations. I am Samarth, and joining me today is Ashwin Singh, Media Strategist at Jellyfish. Ashwin has spent over a decade driving lean growth for brands and SMEs, architecting media strategies grounded in audience intelligence and AI-driven marketing. What makes his perspective especially sharp is that he works with clients on a strict performance budgets, translating the latest marketing effectiveness data into actionable framework that helps them navigate media fragmentation and outmaneuver the category. Ashwin, welcome to the show. All right, Ashwin, before we get into it, give us 30-second version. What do you actually do in day-to-day?
Yeah, sure. I'm a media strategist at Jellyfish, who are an agency as part of the brand tech group. So I sit on the strategy team, and my job is basically to understand the client's business goals, their category, their audience, and then translate that into cross-channel media plans. And to do that, I'm unifying creative media and measurement. Right. As you said, I work with a lot of mid-market brands, particularly those that are reaching what we'd call a performance plateau. And I help them rebuild their media strategies to break through that and drive sustainable growth.
Right. It's very interesting, being from a creative background to performance, a lot of creativity. Let me start, somewhere personal. What's one thing that you had to completely unlearn in last few years?
Yeah, I love that question. I would say for me and probably us as media planners, the one thing that we've had to unlearn is relinquishing that manual control that we have inside ad platforms. So if you think about the old world, it was all about campaign hacking, coming up with granular audience segment, pulling manual bidding levers, that sort of thing. But today, we've now got fully AI-driven campaigns that are infinitely smarter than us. They're better at finding the next conversion. They're better at matching the right creative to the right user. And I think that is almost created a more exciting shift in our job role, because I think we now get to focus on where we as humans can add real value. So for example, bottom of the funnel, like our role now there is simply just to provide the algorithm with volume and diversity of assets. And that gives the AI liquidity that it needs to test and optimize effectively. Right. However, that performance AI needs rich data signals, and I think those data signals are fueled by upper and mid funnel activity. So for me, the real human job today is how do we orchestrate the entire funnel journey, and focusing on building memory structures at the top of the funnel so that AI can perform more effectively at the bottom of the funnel.
Right. Oh, it's interesting. It's interesting, though, and that's really leads us nicely into something that you have been pretty vocal about, and brand versus performance. And why do you call that as a false war?
Yeah, I think that probably stems from an internal conflict that is driven by like a measurement trap. So obviously, on one hand, you've got CFOs who are demanding accountability for immediate targets. And I think performance marketing obviously gives us instant trackable ROI, and that feels safe.
Right.
But the fact is, brand and performance aren't competing with each other. They're just doing separate jobs, and they're working with each other. So performance is obviously capturing demand of people who are ready to buy now, but brand is there to create future demand and mental availability. So, when the 95% of people of your target market who aren't currently in market, when they do enter, you want your brand to be top of mind, or you want them to be more susceptible to your performance ads, and that's what brand helps with. So I think if you're a performance only brand, as I said earlier, like you're going to eventually hit a performance plateau, and that's because you would have exhausted the pool of in-market buyers that are willing to consider you at the moment. And brand isn't there just to refill that, but it's also there to prime the users that are entering the market. So it's acting as like a cognitive shortcut, so that people aren't just seeing your product, but they're now seeing a brand that they're familiar with and a brand that they trust. So it's basically stopping them from scrolling straight past, because the mental work of choosing your brand has already been done. And I think, even beyond that, it's also helping with building pricing power, because that sort of creative is building up the perception of value of your brand. So, by default, it's going to avoid you being cornered into situations where you have to now rely on discounting because you're competing on salience and value instead.
Right.
And I think, the other thing is obviously trying to explain this story to a CFO, I think, is complex, because then you also have to start explaining the lag effect of brand. When you start operating full funnel, it's going to take, at best 3 months, probably 6 months plus for that engine to start working properly. And in the meantime, all you really have to rely on is leading indicators, brand lift, search lift and stuff like that. So I think, creating the confidence and moving to a brand and performance place is a hard job to do. But if I was to give you a case study, one mid-market D2C brand that I've worked with recently, we were doing, in exactly this situation, and we moved to this full funnel strategy, and essentially year on year, our total media spend was flat. Performance setup basically stayed more or less the same. Spend was exactly the same. We were leaning on brand search and then AI-driven campaigns like Advantage Plus and PMAX. So nothing much was changing there. But what we did change was we reallocated a large amount of budget that was being spent on traffic campaigns that weren't necessarily adding much value. But we started to spend that instead on genuine brand building activity at the top of the funnel.
Right.
And we ran that consistently for 6 months. And, we were able to keep confidence up in the strategy by, as I said, leaning on those leading indicators. So proving lift through brand studies, or proving that, salience was happening in market. But what was great was after that 6 month period, the following 6 months, we were seeing conversion rate up across the entire website, across all channels. The ROAS of our performance activity itself was up 44%, despite having not, made any major changes there. And all in all, that led to plus 40% revenue year on year from flat media spend. And for me, that must be more than just market dynamics. It has to be that synergy between brand and performance, and in particular, brand having a multiplier effect on performance activity.
Right.
So yeah, that was we ended up validating that with MMM that we put in place retrospectively as well. So yeah, that was a great case study for us.
Right. Increasing those numbers, that's amazing. And, yet it's a very simple logic to me, I perceive. And you made a very valid point that, it's very difficult to explain to the CFOs what we intend to do. And yet most of the mid-market brands are still stuck in performance first mode, because every pound has to justify itself. And you made a very valid point. But tell me, what's the hidden cost of running a brand purely on performance budgets?
Yeah, so I think, you do end up paying a steep tax for not having that salience. I think performance only, it looks great at first because you're capturing the low hanging fruit. You're going after a highly efficient pool of people. and those people are, either already familiar with your brand or they're compelled by your offer. But that audience, has a natural saturation point, and beyond that, you're going to start seeing diminishing returns quite quickly. So, in order to spend fully, you're going to have to start to reach lower and lower intent users the more and more you spend beyond that point. So as a result, CPAs are going to rise, and in particular, your marginal ROAS is going to look really unhealthy. And, at that point, you're basically on a level playing field with all your competitors, because everyone's going to be using the same performance playbooks. We're all using the same AI bidding, and we probably all have the same understanding of creative best practices when it comes to performance ads. So, without brand equity, then there's no real lever of differentiation. And essentially the consumer is then making a choice based on price and convenience. And that, I think, is, when you're pushed into that place of having to then, think about discounting and stuff like that, which we want to avoid. And so then, the long-term risk becomes that you aren't necessarily acquiring loyal customers. You're essentially, I guess, paying to rent a transaction from Meta and Google, because the likelihood is you'll probably have to pay again to acquire the same user. Because without that brand affinity, that customer is becoming more vulnerable in the next buying cycle. I think competitors can then easily sweep in with a strong brand message or an even more compelling offer, and there's nothing to stop the mindset of that customer switching because they see better value somewhere else. So for me, it's then like, brand isn't just about acquisition. In a way, it's also helping you secure lifetime value as well.
No, actually, that's absolutely true. And brands these days are always on the the customer's lenses or the consumer's lenses. That's always have been the case. So let's get into how do you actually fix this. You have made a very real interesting mention of PMAX and Advantage Plus, and you say creative is the new targeting leveler inside these systems. How does that actually work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a few years ago, like, we obviously would be manually building the targeting through interests, demographics, lookalikes. We'd have many different ad sets and ad groups. And then obviously privacy came along, ATT, GDPR, consent mode. And alongside that, we then had the birth of AI-driven campaigns. And, between those two things, we basically lost our manual control, and we're forced into using broad targeting now. So therefore, if we can't manually target, how does the AI know who to look for? It uses your creative. So when a piece of creative goes out, AI is then watching how people react to that. So who's stopping the scroll, who's watching to 15 seconds, who's clicking. And if it notices a specific type of person is doing that, then it goes out and finds thousands more people like them. So therefore, like, creative has been the signal for that, and therefore creative is the targeting. So, I think that's probably helped us unlock more scale as well, because I think it also removes the bias that we previously had. So, AI can basically go out and find segments of people that we may not have considered targeting previously. So I do think there's some positives there. But I would also say that to do that well, or to do all of this well, we still need to underpin it with strong audience intelligence. So having an understanding of, like, your customers' need states and their pain points is going to help you design the right creative. And when you speak to those psychological triggers, those need states, it's going to elicit a reaction in the viewer, and that reaction is basically the perfect fuel for your AI bidding. And if I can take a slight tangent for a minute and tie that back to the brand and performance conversation, we had an e-commerce client who historically was, like, very reliant on DPAs to drive performance at the bottom of the funnel. With them, we adopted a full funnel approach, and in particular, we started to run more engagement. And I think the AI was picking up on that and using it as a targeting lever. So it was creating more synergy and more overlap between brand and performance.
Right.
And for me, that's a great example of the compounding effects of using brand and performance alongside creative as a targeting lever.
Moving at from the creative side. So if you say creative in doing the targeting now, when we talk about the AI inclusion, what does a high intent creative asset look like? Give us a concrete example.
Yeah, sure. So like a performance asset has one job, right? It's to get the click and close the sale. So at a bare minimum, I think, it needs clear focus on the product, a strong call to action, and it has to remove any friction from clicking through. But beyond that, I think there's a few extra things we can do to level up the effectiveness. So don't know if you've heard of the concept of persuasion drivers before.
Maybe.
So persuasion drivers are psychological triggers that are based on behavioral science. Like a few examples would be social proof is we do what others do. Authority bias is we trust experts. Loss aversion is we hate losing out. Value payoff is clarifying the exact benefit of something. So those are a few examples. There are many more that you can research. But they're basically they're psychological tactics through which you can persuade someone to take an action. And I think testing them in your performance activity can be really valuable. So if we take a premium skincare brand as an example, a lazy ad might be a new serum bottle on a plain background with a shop now button. But a true high intent ad would use distinctive brand cues to trigger memory from, the brand assets that they've seen further up the funnel. So making sure to use the same premium colors, the same typography, the specific visual style created. But on top of that, we can layer persuasion drivers. So that could be, in asset copy, it could be post copy, but the aim is to speak to a specific need state. So if I use the example of authority bias for a premium skincare brand, that might be a branded quote from a dermatologist explaining why it works. Social proof might be a review from someone that says it's the only thing that fixed my dry skin. Right. Or cognitive ease might be a highly visual creative that simply just has a before and after shot. So those are examples of how you can use them to create performance ads. But I think the powerful thing here is when we, they're probably tactics that people already use, but they just haven't labeled it as a specific persuasion driver. But if you do that, you can then A/B test them to understand which specific drivers your audience responds to best. And I think that is powerful because it's not just testing, individual elements. So we're not just testing, changing the background color or changing one word in the tagline or something like that. We're actually understanding human psychology better. And once you get that data back, that then becomes really powerful input into your next creative brief or your next Gen AI prompt. So if you're looking to develop the strongest high intent assets, the key takeaways are probably do the basics well, make sure the product is prominent, strong CTA, low friction. Right. Make sure you've got that cohesive brand identity with your assets across the rest of the funnel. Mm-hmm. And then also understand what persuasion drivers work best for your audience. So combine those three things, and I think you've got a winning formula.
Right. Amazing. And where do you see most of the brands struggle with this? Because it requires approach, something which has to be broken down into small sections. Where do you see that most of the brands, they skip this completely?
You mean in the sense of creating the strongest performance ads?
Yes, you're creating the strongest performance ad, basic things that they miss upon, that they should pay attention to.
Yeah, I think in my experience, you'll be surprised how many people do actually miss the basics. I don't know where that stems from. If it's brands are having to, especially now with the way the AI-driven campaigns work, churn out a large volume of assets. I think it's just maybe having a written playbook in place so that designers can reference, they understand what the job to be done is. It's almost like the basics of media planning, and what the job to be done is at each funnel stage, and then what the best practices are for it, what formats we're going to be using, what's the context of the user at that funnel stage, and explicitly what the asset needs to look like. But then, I think beyond that, what I was saying about A/B testing, I think if we think about the traditional way of doing it, as I was saying, just testing one element, and then that's quite an old school way of doing it. And I think just thinking more about human psychology in that way, and having a framework, in this case persuasion drivers, to label it, that's just going to give you so much more insightful data to be able to use. So I think if we can start thinking smarter about how we A/B test a creative, it's all about the insights that you're getting back. Like, I do see some brands, I think, almost test for the sake of testing. Like, you have to have the hypothesis first, I guess, before you create the asset. So make sure you've gotten, a question that you actually want to answer when you're testing.
Right. No, that's usually it's not the bigger things that create trouble. Is the missing or the lack of paying attention to the details that leads to a bigger problem, and that's what we exactly spoken. But then once all the funnels are taken care from top to bottom, you're changing, and then there's the measurement question that keeps coming up. Incrementally, where does a small team with no data scientist even begin?
Yeah, since that was another great question, and I'll admit, I think that's a difficult one. I think the best place to start would probably be inside the ad platform. So, you don't necessarily need to build the testing infrastructure, as many of the platforms have it for you. So they have built-in conversion lift studies, which only require minimum spends to operate. And in that sense, the data science team at the platform is going to split the audience for you and run the analysis.
Right.
The only caveat with that is obviously you're basically trusting the platform to mark their own homework. So it depends on, if your business is comfortable with that. But I would say to get an independent read of the platform, another thing you could look at is probably a geo rollout test.
Mm-hmm.
So if you pick a city or region and pause activity there, like whatever activity it is you're trying to understand the incrementality of, pause it there for a few weeks. In your back end, like monitor sales in that region versus the rest of the market and how they change. If you're seeing, a decline in that region, it shows that there was incrementality from what you were doing. And I know that's not a super quantifiable number. It's not giving you the exact incrementality. It is giving you a directional insight that activity had value. And, with the absence of a data science team or an MMM or something like that, your options are limited, so you might have to rely on directional insights. And the caveat with that particular approach being external factors like weather, events, economic shifts could muddy the waters a bit. But I guess I would say if you don't have a data science team, then it's probably about not letting perfection be the enemy of progress. You're not going to get a solid, quantifiable read on incrementality with that method. But you are going to get, the confidence to make smart decisions on changing the allocation there to something else or increasing it if there was incrementality.
Right. Well, that makes sense. Because a lot of things on the measurement is it's more to do on the experiment, and it's more to do with what the data talks and how you look at it and where it is heading. And moving forward, now this part, I think will genuinely surprise a lot of people listening. Why is brand search volume no longer a reliable measure of a brand health?
Yeah, I think firstly, the definition of search engine is probably fractured. So, 5 years ago, it was if someone wanted to find your brand, they were going to go straight to Google. But consumer behavior since then is becoming more decentralized. For example, Gen Z and millennials, we know that they're turning more to TikTok and Instagram to search. Whereas for an e-commerce brand, a large number of searches are now beginning straight on somewhere like Amazon. So instantly looking at Google is going to miss a massive chunk of intent. But then on the other hand, we've also got the rise of large language models, which have, fundamentally changed how people search. So they're now using, highly specific, more conversational long tail queries instead of searching for a brand name. So, they're trying to, I guess, ask the engines to solve a particular problem instead. And that shift towards natural language means that, naturally traditional search volume is declining. Despite even if interest in the category or product is growing. But I think the third one is that predictive AI is probably intercepting the search before it even happens. So those AI-driven products like Advantage Plus and PMAX are getting better at reaching people before the search happens. They're getting more and more efficient. So consumers don't have to search, they don't have to pull. As an example, the case study I mentioned earlier where we've driven plus 40% revenue from flat spend. Those results speak for themselves. That's incredible growth year on year. But what was interesting was that client in that period, despite seeing plus 40% revenue, saw a massive drop in brand search volume. And, so if we were using brand search volume as the measure there, that would tell you a totally different story. But I think the reason is a greater portion of revenue was now coming from channels like organic and social, Advantage Plus and PMAX rather than brand search. So the demand there was growing. It just wasn't evident through brand search. Yeah, but I think, if you're thinking about like what to look at instead, social listening and share of voice could be an important one, especially if we think about, the way social works now and being less about followers and more about how good your content is. Like the platforms reward great content that gets engagement with more reach. So share of voice becomes more important, and therefore tracking your prominency in the conversation is a good proxy for your brand health. And then, within advertising, you've got brand lift studies, which give you, you get the volume of your target markets who are aware or would consider your brand. And I think in those lift studies, one particular metric that I think is great is measuring unaided awareness rather than aided awareness, because I think that gives you a good set of the mental availability that you have. So, when you think of so-and-so category, what's the brand that comes to mind first? And, you want your brand to be coming to mind first. And I think another one is, going back to the large language models conversation, they're obviously now functioning as the new top funnel. People are starting their searches there. So understanding your brand health in that context, I think, is really important, because if you aren't showing up there or you aren't perceived well by the different models, then your brand health is going to fall, because that's where consumers are now going. So, for example, like at Jellyfish, we've got a proprietary piece of tech called Share Model, and we're able to track your mention rate across different models, your average position, how each model perceives you. And that's really powerful, because it means that we can take that data away and, seed the correct narratives into the market to prevent our sort of brand health declining in that setting. Also large language models are a consensus of the real world. So it is also a valuable proxy for your brand health, I think. And essentially, I guess it's future-proofing your brand health, because you can, because that's that context is going to continue to grow. So if you're defending yourself in that context, you're going to prevent a lack of visibility there affecting your brand health in the future.
Right. I completely agree. Because this is even I have experienced. The traffic is being divided. The platforms are growing. From the search, legacy search engines to the modern LLM models are eating away the traffics, and people want that precise information that they are looking for, and which has led to the less clicks. And so that has been the really case of lately in my experience. And more on the measurement, and on measurement rather more broadly, you have cited a stat that really stuck with me. Last click attribution, over credits, paid search by 190%. Why is the industry still running on it? What's the catch there?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I guess the answer to that is simple, in the sense that it's easy and easy wins. It survived this long because it gives you a clean, defensible number. In reality, it might not be accurate, 100% accurate, but the evidence of like a click leading to a purchase is right there in front of you. And obviously paid search, love it because it makes their ROAS great. And paid search agencies, it's going to justify their retainers. So I think no one who's winning on the current system is going to be in a hurry to blow it up in that sense. And then if we start to think about the alternatives, like migrating to a multi-touch attribution model is going to be hard. I think both politically in terms of getting the buy-in of all the various stakeholders, but also the technical setup, and that's beyond my expertise. But I know that's no easy feat. So, and I think probably thirdly, actually, the phenomena that bad data that is confident probably beats good data that's probable. So, a human probably prefers last click did this versus this channel probably did this.
Right.
So I think, MLM's probably the closest fix that we have to it. And it's definitely becoming more accessible and readouts are becoming more frequent. I guess adoption there is probably still low because there's still the education piece of, whoever's controlling the budgets, there's still a cost there. Whoever's controlling those budgets needs to understand the measurement gap. And,
right.
That narrative isn't necessarily an easy one to tell.
Right. Now, great insight. I think we have covered, from measurement to AI to, how fast it is getting into the entire space. And now moving forward is rapid fire. 30-second max, first instinct. Are you ready?
Go for it.
All right. Okay. PMAX, a useful tool or an expensive autopilot?
Useful tool.
Useful tool. The marketing metric you wish never had been invented.
In-platform ROAS. I don't think that's, just simply for the fact that it's not useful and it never has been.
Right. One brand whose media, creative, and data you genuinely admire right now.
I'm going to say Ancient and Brave.
Okay.
Because try not to think too hard about it. But that's the first brand that came to mind, which means that they hold mental availability in my head. So they must be doing something right.
Fair enough. Amazing. AI in marketing from 5 years now. More humans or less?
More human.
More
I
human.
don't think it'd be possible to get less human.
Right. One word to describe marketing in 2026.
Human.
Human.
I think that'll be a topic that everyone's talking about.
Yeah. Most underrated growth leveler.
Growth lever, frequency.
All right. Performance max or advantage plus?
Advantage plus.
Right. AI, hype or real advantage?
Real advantage. I think we've covered a lot of that today, yeah.
Yeah, we did. In fact, I think, most of the conversation was in and around that. All right. Final question. Coffee or chai?
Masala chai over coffee. Coffee over chai latte.
Masala chai is favorite of mine too. All right. Your last question, and I want you to be as, probably ruthless is not the right word, or, as specific as you can be. One thing someone listening right now can change in next 30 days. What is that?
Well, that is a great question. Out of the many things that we've covered today, what can we do quickly? I would say maybe the persuasion drivers. That's probably the quickest to implement is, start formulating a testing framework around those. Research what persuasion drivers might be relevant for your brand, and that are going to help you get a better understanding of your audience's psychology. And you could probably set up some A/B testing pretty quickly to start getting that insight. And that insight is going to be really powerful for you.
Okay, perfect. And is there anything that you are working or you want to point people towards?
So LinkedIn's probably the only place to go and find me. Ashwin Singh 2. That's where you can find me.
Right.
No specific PR to point you towards at the moment, though.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you, Ashwin. That's a wrap on today's episode. Ash, this was such a sharp conversation. I think the big takeaways, for me, is that the brands winning right now I'm the ones picking between brand and value for the consumers. Thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time. Thank you, Ashwin.
We are signing off from this episode of Data Demand, but the journey doesn't end here. Stay tuned to MarTech 360 for more insights and strategies that can help you master the MarTech landscape.